We continue our broadcast this morning on News and Views right here on Salam Media. We stay in the company of our Salam Media listeners on the various platforms of Salam Media and also our One Nation 88.9 FM listeners out of Polokwane. We welcome you to the show this morning. Now, still to come on the show this morning, shortly we will be joined by Ruth Hopkins, independent investigative journalist, and a little later on in the program, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, former Minister of Health, ANC presidential contender, will be with us. But right now, we're going across talking about the alleged brutality that is taking place in the Mangaung prison. You will recall last week we had the opportunity of talking to one of the inmates from the prison itself, and clearly a lot of cause for concern. And we've got investigative journalists, independent investigative journalists, I must add, sharing her journey and experience in uncovering some of the alleged brutality in Mangaung prison. Ruth Hopkins, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Good morning to you too, and to your
Yes,
listeners.
wonderful you're able to join us now. Clearly, last week when we spoke to one of the inmates out of the prison, there was just so much that he had basically unpacked. And Ruth, looking at your journey, your experience in uncovering what is taking place in Mangaung prison, just take us through some of the critical issues that we need to be talking about.
Well, yeah, I heard the interview you had with the inmate, and actually, it really saddens me because I've been I'm no longer based in South Africa, but I used to live there, and for 10 years, I investigated that prison. I broke the story in 2013, and the story of widespread torture, abuse. Forced injections with antipsychotic drugs. I broke that story in 2013 and kept writing about the prison and everything going on there. And then in 2020, so 2 years ago, my book came out called Misery Merchants, all about this G4S run prison in Bloemfontein. And there was also a film made about my work called Prison for Profit. And I'm in journalism for impact, and when I hear that interview, I just think nothing has changed. I find it really saddens me.
Well, certainly, and also, you mentioned G4S, and G4S has been in the news for the wrong reasons because they have been known to be notorious, and we know what is taking place, as far as the Palestinians are concerned. But again, G4S for the wrong reasons, under the radar.
Yeah, I mean, G4S is the biggest private security provider in the world. They employ currently around 750,000 people all over the world. And I've also set up something called the Private Security Network. So a network of journalists from all over the world who are looking into the private security sector, and they've looked in specifically into G4S and what it's doing in countries such as Colombia, India, Mozambique, etc., and also in Europe. And it's just, if you look at the company on a global scale, it's just leaving behind a trail of destruction because they premise their business on maximum profit and minimum expenses, such as labor. So labor constantly gets undervalued, really, and that leads to a whole score of problems in the prisons, but also just generally in the security operations.
Ruth, now the fact that you've looked at this, and I mean, 10 years is a very, very long time, and 10 years later, we still are talking about what is going on in Mangaung, and nothing seems to have changed, as you mentioned.
No. Well, there've been minor changes. I believe that when I started investigating this prison in 2012, they were injecting randomly, or indiscriminately injecting people who didn't have a history of mental illness. They would inject them with antipsychotic drugs as a form of crowd control. And I think that has stopped. So some inmates who suffer from mental illness still get injected, but you could say that they should be injected, or at least they're in need of medical assistance. But what I documented in 2012-13 was just random use of it was used as a form of crowd control, not as a form of mental illness medication.
Yes. Now, looking at the outcome as far as your investigation is concerned, looking at the authorities, looking at correctional services. I mean, what have they been saying?
Well, the response, generally speaking, from South African institutions or the legal landscape has been very disappointing. A court case was started to apply for, a civil case was started for the inmates that petered out. The Constitutional Court at one point showed an interest, then that petered out. So there's been very little follow-up from correctional services. I mean, correctional services, they took over the prison in 2013, but then it was handed back to G4S, and there's been no real accountability for what I would say are very serious human rights violations of people who've committed crimes, yes, but they shouldn't be tortured, they shouldn't be killed. They shouldn't be injected with antipsychotic drugs. That's not according to the promises South Africa made in the field of human rights, and especially given
Yes.
South Africa's history.
Ruth, it's taken people like yourself as an independent investigative journalist to bring all of this out to light. But what we see very little happening is in South Africa, we don't see the mainstream media talking about this, and we need to understand why. I mean, what are they shying away from? Because this is a major issue. It is a serious issue that needs to be unpacked. It needs to be unleashed as a major talking point in this country.
Yeah, and I think what the problem there is it's very South African, but it's also universal in the sense that inmates often don't really attract a lot of sympathy. And I noticed in South Africa that I used to work for the Wits Justice Project, so I've been to I don't know how many prisons in South Africa. It's an investigative journalism outfit focused on the criminal justice system, and I research prisons, and we would write about not just privately run prisons, also state-run prisons. Torture, for example, is widespread. And we would write about that, and people would say, well, what's the problem? Yeah, go and torture them, hang them, reintroduce the death penalty. So incarceration as an issue is just not something that attracts public outcry. And I think you see that very clearly in South Africa, that has a very real problem with crime, that people don't have the energy to or the will to show any empathy with this group of people. And then secondary, it's also the problem of corruption, and especially with privately run prisons, they are hugely expensive and big amounts of money are in circulation, and it feeds corruption. So that's another reason why there's very little accountability.
Yes, Ruth. In fact, what you're saying is very true, because we know people have become desensitized as a result of the crime. But again, the crime problem is not about the criminal, and it's not about the inmate in prison only. It is about a bigger problem as far as the system is concerned, and also looking at some of the rationale or the thinking and the reasons behind crime. And again, it points out to the authorities, the powers that be, the government, and they are obviously doing absolutely nothing about crime. Many of them, sadly, are criminals themselves in more ways than one. And you mentioned corruption, which is just one of the examples. So this is the reason why there is this lack of urgency in dealing with the matter, and also a lack of focus.
Yeah. And my question is, why is G4S still active in South Africa? It's one of South Africa's biggest private employers. and it's the BEE Commission is currently investigating G4S because they didn't adhere as a company. They have more than just the prison. They didn't adhere to Black economic empowerment measures. So they're, excuse my English, screwing up across the board, and yet still, they're still here. They still have their contracts. There's been no accountability, also not from the government. While there's been more than enough evidence, it's been documented, and I think it's just sadly money speaks and money covers up.
Well, certainly does. But just where to from here, Ruth? I mean, you've written a book, you've written extensively. There has been a movie that has been made. Where to from here? And especially looking at the inmates in Mangaung, what other options do they have?
Sorry to say they don't have a lot of options. I mean, nothing has changed, and I've gone out there. I've risked my own safety. I've really tried to address this one particular issue in this one particular prison, and I don't see much impact. So honestly, I don't know specifically what inmates currently incarcerated in Mangaung prison can do. I really don't. More broadly speaking, what to do about the problem of privately run prisons, because I think that in itself is a problem. I would say what's an interesting idea is that, because I don't have a problem with the fact that these prisons are privately run, I have a problem with the fact that they're run for profit. And what you could conceive of is prisons run by non-profits who are not driven by the urge to earn money, because I think that's the profit driven incarceration, that's where the problem lies, that it's profit driven. And so it could be conceived of as a system that's run by non-profits who adhere to human rights.
Well, definitely. And I think, talking about human rights, and clearly human rights organizations need to get involved. They need to make certain noises. And also at the same time, we've tried to get in touch with G4S to give them a right for reply. That hasn't materialized. We've tried to get somebody out of correctional services. That hasn't happened. So at this point in time,
And
it's a stalemate.
that doesn't surprise me one bit.
Yeah, well, so we are at a stalemate, but obviously we will keep on trying, and hopefully, we can actually get someone to at least say something, someone to comment, and someone to respond. But for now, Ruth, we thank you for taking time out, talking to us this morning, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
All the best to you. Ruth Hopkins, independent investigative journalist, joining us out of the United Kingdom. And as she mentioned, her journey, her experience, and obviously put her in a very difficult situation as well, even fearing for her own safety in uncovering the brutality and the goings on at the Mangaung prison. The time is just gone, 9:33, and when we come back, we are going to be joined by Dr. Zweli Mkhize, the former Minister of Health, also presidential contender in the upcoming electoral conference.